The Final Furlong podcast is proudly brought to you by Geoff Banks Bet. Join the excitement and sign up to Geoff Banks online now to get 10% off any net losses returned as cash after your first month of betting up to £500 at geoffbanks.bet. Welcome along to the Final Furlong podcast. Normally on the show, we're talking to you about the horses to follow, the racing that we've just seen and the big racing festivals that we're all excited about, maybe a bit of bloodstock. But we have talked quite a bit on the show about your right to gamble and how it's coming under attack in the United Kingdom with the gambling white paper and restrictions on gambling. What if we were to tell you that a lot of what you're hearing is absolute lies? Not to be a conspiracy theorist with an Alex Jones style tinfoil hat, but what if what you are listening to is actual lies? Well, here to combat those are three industry experts, and we're very glad to have their company on the show today. First up, Dan Waugh. He advises on the regulation of gambling with a focus on safer gambling. He's published several journal papers on the subject and has provided evidence to parliamentary committees. We're very pleased to have his assistance and his time and insight on the show today. Chris Fawcett is a data scientist and machine learning coder. He's also a massive horse racing fan and a hugely successful bettor for over 30 years. He runs the website gamblingreform.co.uk and he's been fighting affordability checks and misinformation surrounding betting since the publication of the white paper, even before that. And Geoff Banks, full disclosure, a sponsor of this show, but also one of the most recognizable faces in British horse racing. He's got prominent pitches all over the United Kingdom at some of the most prominent racecourses in the UK. He's also a former star of the Morning Line. He'd be winding up Ruby Walsh, and he runs, of course, a hugely successful independent betting site as well. We're very grateful to the three of you for joining us on the show today. Dan, I want to start with you. There's a very, very serious thing that is brought up in all of the debates, particularly on corporate media when there's various different discussions about why restrictions need to be implemented, and that is suicide. Now, suicide is an incredibly serious thing, and it's not to in any way say that there is no such thing as somebody who has spiraled into debt through an addiction from gambling, who has seen no way out other than to do the worst thing of all, a permanent solution to a temporary problem. But the statistics, there is very little pushback about those statistics. And there is now clear evidence that the stats that are being brandied about in establishment media and corporate media are simply not true. Why are these statistics made up, and why is there no pushback about them?
Thanks, Emmett. Yeah, I mean, I think the starting point is you reference, we've known for a long time that people with gambling disorder, as with other psychiatric disorders, are at elevated risk of self-harm, and we should take that seriously. But taking things seriously and making up statistics are incompatible, in my view. The numbers that are bandied about in the press tend to come from two British government-sponsored studies, one by Public Health England, and then a revision from the Office for Health Improvement and Disparities, which is part of the Department for Health. Now, they are based on a study in Sweden that was conducted in 2018, which looked at elevated risk of self-harm for people in hospital with a diagnosis of gambling disorder. And that study found that these patients were 15 times more likely to die by suicide. What Public Health England and OHID did was then to say, well, okay, if we apply that to the number of problem gamblers in England, we get this number. And they churned out a figure of 409. OHID then produced either a choice of 117 or 496. And that's where the state estimates come from. However, there's some big problems with this. And they really rely on two pieces of flat earth logic. The first piece of flat earth logic they employ is that there is no association between risk of suicide and severity of gambling problems. Okay, you have to believe that to believe these numbers. The second piece of flat earth logic you have to believe is that there is no association between any psychiatric illness or any physical illness and risk of suicide, with the sole exception of gambling disorder. Okay, so if you can get your heads around those two things, if you can believe those two things, you can, at least for a while, believe these numbers are true. If you don't believe those things, you cannot believe those numbers are true. Another point that's worth making, you can't believe the PHE number if you are mathematically illiterate, because it is mathematically incorrect, as OHID subsequently admitted. So the reason why these are flat earth logic is, first of all, what PHE and OHID did was to take their estimate of mortality for people with gambling disorder in hospital and apply it to anybody in England who had a PGSI classification of problem gambler in a survey. Okay, so the first people are clinically diagnosed with a psychiatric illness. The second bunch of people are not. There's no diagnosis of psychiatric illness. Instead, there's a classification of problem gambler, which basically means gambling is not playing a positive role in your life. It's likely to be causing some negative adverse consequences, which is very different to saying you've got a disorder. It's a little bit like saying you drink too much versus you've got an alcohol use disorder. These are different by orders of magnitude. So if you believe the health risks for people with gambling disorder are the same as for people with problem gambling, you are saying that there is no association between severity of gambling problems and risk of self-harm, right? The second thing is that when we look at this study in Sweden, the very first study, we find very high levels of comorbidity. So they had other things that are wrong with them. 60% had anxiety disorders, 50% had depression, 41% had drug use disorders, 29% had alcohol use disorders, and so on and so on. So these were very sick people. So again, to say that the same health risks apply for this population as to anybody in England with a gambling problem, but with no other, say, psychiatric or physical health problems, is to assume that those other psychiatric and physical health problems have no bearing on risk of suicide. Now, the Swedish researchers conducted a few other studies. The second study they did, they looked at the risk of attempted suicide for people with gambling disorder if you also had either alcohol or substance use disorder. They found that if you just had the gambling disorder and you didn't have substance use or alcohol disorder, the risk of suicide attempt halved. So that's before controlling for any other factors. If you just control for alcohol and drugs, the risk of suicide attempt halved. They conducted 3 more studies. The fourth study, they used a control group. And in that control group, they tested for other risk factors. And they concluded, and this was published last year, they concluded controlling for other known risk factors, gambling disorder, in the study group they analysed, does not appear to be a significant risk factor for increased suicide. So if people want to believe these numbers that OHID and PHE have bandied about, then you have a dilemma. Because if you believe the analysis of this Swedish data set of people in hospital with a range of health conditions is an accurate way to assess the health of people in England with none of these conditions, then you've got to conclude that it's not a significant risk factor, because that's the conclusion the Swedish researchers came to. If you don't believe it's a reliable way to do it, then you can't believe PHE and OHID anyway, because that's the basis of their calculations. So whichever way you look, these numbers cannot stand up.
How are we supposed to get our heads around the fact that there are organizations who are conflating statistics this serious?
Well, I think the first observation is that anybody who believes implicitly in the honesty of government has not been paying attention, or they are putting hope way in excess of experience here. Okay, so that's the first observation.
I agree with you, Dan. You were a conspiracy theorist, but not on the playbook.
I just think, you know, actually, and we'll come on to the Gambling Commission at some point, I imagine, but the Hampton Code, the Code of Regulation for regulators in this country says actually regulators need to be scrutinised. Governments need to be scrutinised. If we don't do that, we get into a real mess. So the idea that you can just say, oh, a government department said something, therefore it must be true, I think is naive and rather dangerous. But I think you touched on an important point where somebody suffered bereavement. You know, they will express, I hate the term, but they'll express what's true to them. They may be inclined to try to seek comfort in statistics that give them some sort of comfort. And you can understand that. But when taxpayer funds are used to fabricate statistics about something as serious as suicide, that is deeply disturbing. And another point that's worth mentioning is that it's almost become, you know, I have written about this, I have called it out. Everything I've done has been based on facts and statistics, and yet it's deemed to be somehow distasteful to point out the errors in these statistics. And in fact, one member of the regulatory establishment has actually written that. He wrote, yes, this is the chair of the Advisory Board for Safer Gambling, which advises the Gambling Commission. She admitted that Public Health England's numbers were incorrect, but she went on to say, but it doesn't matter. In effect, this is what she was writing. It doesn't matter, because what really matters is what's important to those harmed by gambling. Now, that might be an empathetic way of looking at the world, but it's not a scientific way. And I think the moment we let emotion and pure unadulterated empathy dictate policy or dictate what is perceived to be true in the face of scientific evidence to the contrary, then we're in big trouble. And I think it's the honest, it's the responsible thing to be quite critical about manufactured statistics. It's a responsible thing to be rigorous about statistics and evidence. It is the irresponsible thing to let these things slide because you think there's some sort of noble lie here. You think that it's okay to make things up because it's in a good cause. That is a very slippery slope. And I just don't understand any other health condition where you'd go, it's okay to make up statistics. Would we say it's okay to make up statistics on heart disease or cancer? You know, I just don't think that's acceptable in those realms. It shouldn't be acceptable in this subject.
Is your conclusion, Dan, from all your research that the health departments and the Gambling Commission know that these statistics are wrong?
The Gambling Commission wrote in, this is an internal memo that was obtained under the Freedom of Information Act in April 2022. So more than 2 years ago, the Gambling Commission reviewed, after we'd been to see them and expressed our concerns about the Public Health England report, the Commission reviewed it. And they wrote in an internal memo that there was no reliable data upon which PHE could make their estimates.
So why did they not challenge what was being said? Like 2 suicides a day by anti-gambling lobbyists was being parked around the media, actively parked against the industry, unchallenged. So why did the regulator of gambling not step in at that point to say that these figures were unsafe?
Well, that's a question for the regulator, but what we do know is that the Gambling Commission was asked whether they thought the statistics were reliable. This is after they'd done this analysis. They were asked whether they thought the statistics were reliable. And they said, it's not our job to check the statistics of another state agency. Well, no, it's not your job, but you had done it and you knew they're unreliable. So to stay quiet, I think, is to be complicit in the lie. And that is not consistent, I think, with the statutory duties of the Gambling Commission. The Gambling Commission is also required to advise the Secretary of State on gambling matters. So I would say the responsible thing for the Commission to have done would have been to advise the Secretary of State that these suicide numbers were not based on reliable data, because that's their opinion. It's there in black and white. They elected not to do that. And I think that's really calls into question their impartiality on these things, particularly when it's worth reflecting the Gambling Commission plans to produce its own suicide statistics later this year. So how much trust can we have in what comes next when the Commission has shown zero interest in the promotion of responsible statistics in such an emotive area?
If you know this, and you're able to quote that off by heart in the detail that you are, then why are the interviewers who are very well spoken and they've got a whole research teams and producers, why are they not standing up and saying, actually, we've looked into this, these statistics are all wrong? Well,
I think in fairness to the mainstream news media, there hasn't been much pushback on this. We've written reports, we've written articles, we have spoken to some people in the mainstream news media, and the sort of response comes back, it's a sensitive subject. We don't want to publish anything rebutting this. So we've had the odd, Racing Post has carried pieces, some of the sort of trade media. Chris Snowden, who writes for The Critic and others, has published a very good piece last week. So it has been, the concerns about this have been raised, but not in the sort of national news media. And I suppose if you're the BBC, for example, and you're being told something and you're being told that it comes with the government department approval, you probably don't find the rebuttal pieces. And I think that's partly because, or mainly even because, the gambling industry has decided to turn a blind eye to this one, by and large, with some exceptions. But the big gambling operators have sort of said, this is too difficult a subject. We don't want to talk about suicide. So the corollary of not wanting to talk about suicide is you don't point out when misinformation is happening.
Because it's such an emotive subject, and because so many people want to virtue signal and be seen to be right, they don't want to challenge something as serious as that. They just want to take it as given.
I'm not being totally unsympathetic here to any parties involved in this, but even the Commission, I understand how difficult it would have been for the Commission to have spoken up, albeit I still think that because it's difficult, it still makes it worth doing. I think similarly for the industry will be saying, look, we don't want to be seen to be insensitive here by debunking these myths. But the consequence of that is these myths become accepted, and now people simply don't challenge them. And I say with the Public Health England one, anybody who had read the Public Health England report, anyone with any knowledge of problem gambling, or anybody who'd bothered to check the maths, would have realized it was wrong. So anybody who's promoted the statistics simply hasn't checked it.
Geoff, why are the Gambling Commission so intransigent to the complaints of bettors?
Like you, I read everywhere punters, consumers complaining about the regulators' intransigence to their problems. They don't get their withdrawals on time. Anybody that has a bet and wins and withdraws their money should be entitled to get paid on the same day wherever possible. They should just get paid because they deposit their money that day, and if they win that day, they should just get paid. And all I read online is constant complaints from punters that the regulator is doing nothing for them, absolutely nothing for them. And at the same time, in the background, we are aware that there are tens of thousands of legitimate gambling accounts, people that gamble, whose accounts now are being closed, or alternatively have just walked away from gambling because they refuse to reasonably hand over their sensitive, confidential financial data to companies like Entain, who have been fined by the Gambling Commission nearly £20 million for bad behaviour, and fined by the HMRC nearly £600 million for bribing officials. And we are expected, or punters are expected, to hand over their bank statements and their P60s to companies like that. And I call them company in the sort of broadest sense of the word, because everybody knows that Entain are just literally the lowest of the low in gambling and have been for many years with the whole Fawcett debacle. But people need to understand online, when they complain about these things, that the last thing in life that the Gambling Commission is interested in is in making the balloon bigger, making gambling bigger in the United Kingdom. The modern day Gambling Commission, led by Andrew Rhodes, believes in a document called the National Strategy for Gambling Harms. And that document, or that belief, that code believes that every bet that is placed, no matter how small that bet might be, represents a tiny package of harm. A tiny package of harm. Even if you just have a little £2 lottery bet, that represents a tiny package of harm. And the totality of that little bit of harm across the whole gambling spectrum equals a great deal of gambling harm. Obviously, as Steve Donahue put it, this is the mantra of people that must have been smoking crack from a very young age. But this is where they have got to with documents like this strategy. So the modern day Gambling Commission believes in, and everything that I see points directly to this. My overwhelming impression is that all they want to do is to reduce gambling, not problem gambling, but to reduce gambling in the United Kingdom substantially. And in doing so, they reduce the amount of gambling harm that is based on this mantra that they have. So people who complain that the Gambling Commission is doing nothing for them don't understand today's Gambling Commission, in my opinion. Today's Gambling Commission is not about growing the cake. It's about reducing the cake. And that for every punter that is lost, that never gambles again, has their accounts closed, drifts off to the black market, the Gambling Commission have shown that there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that the Gambling Commission give a shit about these people. Their rights, they're people that have gambled all their lives, they're without problem, perfectly healthy people, as the vast majority of people are. Millions of gamblers never have any problem gambling, and the Gambling Commission has never apologized, never explained, never given any theorems or anything, any code that basically is turned around and said, we're sorry that in order to protect people, all of these other people must have their lives reduced, must have the quality of their lives reduced. We're not interested if we harm those people, if we take things away from the from the way that they live their lives. If a pensioner, for example, who wrote in the Racing Post that Tom Kerr talked about recently, who wrote into gambling, I've gambled all my life. Now I'm being told I have to hand my paperwork over to companies like Entain, and I'm saying no. So therefore, my accounts, my ability to gamble that I've done successfully, and just whether you won or lost this old pension, it didn't really matter. He's just being shut down. And Andrew Rhodes is studiously unapologetic about all of these people and their rights to pursue their hobby, their activity, their enjoyment in life, something that they do. And let's face it, we go out, we work hard, we sit in traffic all the time. People's enjoyments in life go into avenues that there's always groups of people, lobbyists, that say you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't go down the pub, you shouldn't gamble, you shouldn't drink, you shouldn't smoke, and you shouldn't eat too much, and all the rest of it. And there are always lobbyists that will tell you shouldn't do this. But this is how people let off steam. This is how people enjoy their lives. And why I detest the policymakers at the Gambling Commission, they're not all bad people. I've spoken to a lot of them. There are a lot of good people who work in the Gambling Commission, but those that set policy at the top, to me, they are appalling people because they don't care about the lives of individuals and their enjoyment, their activities, how they choose to spend their money. They don't care that they're being forced by these measures to hand over their paperwork to companies that the Gambling Commission have been routinely fining for bad behavior. And I don't blame the punters for being incredibly upset about this kind of thing. And therefore, I do blame people like Andrew Rhodes when he says that everybody's combative if they don't agree with my opinion, basically. And I understand all the people in racing and dog racing, which doesn't get mentioned very often, whose very lives are under threat. Where are their rights in this gambling commission? When do they sit down when they incept policy and say, well, hold on a second, if we do this, what will be the effect on the countryside for horse racing, for greyhound racing, and all the people that depend upon it, the jockeys, the valets, the stable lads, the trainers, everything like that? What will be the net effect of that? Andrew Rhodes's responses in the most recent pods basically says he doesn't care. It's not his job to care about the net effect of policies that he advocates. That's what he says. He's very clear on that. It's not my job to look at the effect of what I do, of the policies that I expostulate. It's not down to me. It's down to ombudsmen that don't exist to protect the punters. They don't exist. He's fully aware that his measures with regard to affordability, that the bookmakers are not companies like mine, but bookmakers are using it for gain, for financial gain. And Chris will literally be leaping out of his chair in a minute, but they are using it for financial gain. They are fully aware of this. They don't care. And for that reason, I'm with the punters. I'm with the punters when they say that this gambling commission is useless. It's not fit for purpose. It is not representing consumers. It just basically represents the views of anti-gambling lobbyists and their call for all gambling to be banned.
Just to reinforce a couple of points that Geoff made. One is this: what is gambling harm? Now, we can recognize severe harms, and we don't argue about the nature of them. We might argue about the quantity of them. But in recent years, there's been a real lowering of the threshold on what is considered harmful. If you go onto the Gambling Commission's website today, you will find it written there that if you spend less money going to the cinema because you've decided to have a bet, you've been harmed by gambling. Now, that's not a harm in my book. That is a trade-off. That's an opportunity cost, right? It's or a choice. It's a choice. You decided to have a bet on a race, and therefore you're not going to the cinema or going out to the pub or something like that. But on the Gambling Commission's website today, it says that you have been harmed by gambling if that is what you've done.
Sorry, Dan, I don't mean to interrupt you. And I actually said beforehand, let's not interrupt one another as we're recording. So what do? I interrupt Dan as he's in full flow. But if somebody watching this was to go and buy themselves a Tommy Hilfiger sweater, and then they go to the cinema, but they have to buy a cheaper ticket because they overspent on that sweater, does that mean they've been harmed by buying that sweater?
they've been harmed by Tommy. I think they should file a lawsuit, personally. But, yeah.
Yeah.
So this is, they've also got, have you spent less time with your loved ones as a result of your gambling? Well, yes, I spend less time with my loved ones because I go to work. I spend less time with my loved ones because, I might go and watch the football. So, once you do this, you lower everything in life becomes harmful. Now, this sort of ideology came out of Australia in the middle of the last decade. Just the other month, a document was produced in Australia which said, gambling harm includes momentary feelings of regret or guilt. Now,
we've all felt that.
Yeah, I mean, I have my whole day consists of momentary feelings of guilt and regret, okay?
I had a regret today from a bet that I placed, but that's part of it.
But you have guilt and regret related to pretty much everything you do.
This week they experienced regret.
Yeah. So here's the thing. So once you lower the threshold of harm to that level, it's possible to show that everybody's experiencing harm, in which case it becomes justifiable to impose controls on everyone. And that's really what's at the heart of this. In order to promote an agenda which is, if you go to Public Health England and Office of Health Improvement and Disparities, they have openly written, we want to tackle gambling, not problem gambling. We want to tackle gambling in the same way that we've tackled tobacco consumption. That is their game. Now, I should point out that's not the Gambling Commission's stated aim. And in fact, the Gambling Commission did kind of quietly take exception with them on that, although I would have preferred it if they'd taken a sort of more public exception to them on that. But that is their stated aim. So all of this comes from this idea of gambling as the new tobacco, which these public health bodies are very keen to promote. And therefore, it comes down to, okay, how can we show that widespread harm from gambling, which is where either adopting very low thresholds comes in, like ridiculously low thresholds, or inventing statistics about really severe harms. Because once you do that, once you can say, oh, no, but look, 500 people are dying, it sort of bulldozes through any argument for moderation.
There's plenty of things that we could talk about in that regard that are damaging to people's health. There's an awful lot that you have to process here, Chris, because obviously Geoff had his brilliant monologue there. Dan has just added to it, and I know that you're chomping at the bit. But I'm a dum-dum talking into a microphone, right? I'm a broadcaster. What do I know? But even I can see that if you're going to impose restrictions on gambling, shouldn't that be across the board then? Because if you're so concerned about that gambling is this dangerous thing that people can lose control with, and you want to essentially impose prohibition, but you can't ban it outright, first of all, so you have to impose these little restrictions first before you get there, then you'd obviously do the same thing to the lottery. Because the lottery is something you can go into a shop, you can fill your car with petrol and go, really feeling it with the lotto, 50 quid, 100 quid on scratch cards. You've made the point on X on numerous occasions, the lottery is completely immune from this. There's nothing being done about that. You can go and spend as much money as you want on lottery tickets. You can buy as many scratch cards. And that's backed by Andrew Rhodes. Surely that's hypocrisy.
Well, it's not just that. It's also land-based slot machine, these shops that are springing up everywhere that now you can use debit cards on, or it's coming out, you can use debit cards on those. And I've no objection to that if that's what people want to do. But why is that exempt? But online, where you can monitor everything, and everything is digitized so that, the government or the companies can see exactly what you're doing, they're the places where they're bringing us in first. And I think what you'll end up with is a gambling card that wherever you go, you'll have to use this card to gamble. So you hand over the card, they've got a record of all your bets, and they'll say, right, you've reached your limit, sorry. That's where I think this will end up. That's not what they're saying is where it's going to end up. I think that's where we're going to go.
You're talking about open banking, but on an extreme
I'm talking
scale.
About a card, a gambling card. I mean, so I think some of the shops already have like a loyalty card. So you might get better odds if you've got this card, or best odds guaranteed or something like that. But eventually I think all your gambling will be monitored via some sort of credit card or something on your phone.
But that's much more nefarious than just playing a game where you end up giving over your data and you didn't realize that's what you were doing, or signing up for something where, again, you're giving away your data and none of us realized how valuable all that was. This is about control. This is controlling what you can do and monitoring what you can do.
In Australia, I think they're bringing it in, I've read, in casinos where you have to have this card that monitors what you spent. That's sort of the long term where I think this will go. The whole basis of this, the first I really heard of it was of this idea that harm, you've got like the tip of the pyramid, which is suicides, and then it dissipates all the way down to like, you know, someone, your wife can't buy a new pair of shoes or something because you spent the money gambling. And I think, so that would be harm. Or perhaps you can't have the best food to feed your family or something like that. And the view now seems to be, or has been since 2019, I heard Tim Miller's talking about this, that the Gambling Commission is all about reducing this harm, so-called gambling harm. It's not about protecting the general consumer from, you know, bookmakers not paying out or, you know, restrictions and all that sort of thing. To me, the Gambling Commission has, 3 jobs: to keep gambling fair and open, to keep crime out of it, and I think there's a third, can't remember the third one, but there's 3 reasons for its existence. But there's nothing on the fairness. It is to stop harm, isn't it? That's the third one. But that seems to be the only thing they're focusing on.
Just looking at my figures, you know, just from online today, and our average stake is £53 per bet. £53. So we are as a company unnaturally high, I would say, and that's probably mirrored at Bitstairs and at Star Sports. So we are unnaturally high, but I'm very compelled that, you know, when you're talking about gambling harm, Emmet, you know, to try to put a number on gambling harm is nonsensical, because if you've only got 20 quid in your pocket and you gamble that 20 quid such that you don't have, you know, you can't afford to buy your dinner that night or anything like that, then you are experiencing harm. I mean, what appears to be happening right now is the Gambling Commission, who did advocate affordability checks, and Andrew Rhodes lied about that situation, denying that the Gambling Commission had ever advocated affordability checks. That's a lie. It's a clear lie, and everybody knew it was a lie. But the fact is that, you know, somebody who bets at a very low level, doesn't have a lot of money in life, these people can experience, you know, a gambling harm. And what's happening right now is it's disproportionately, it's being people at the top, people with more money, people who gamble more because they choose to or because they can afford to, are being discriminated against by modern day policy. Because, you know, if you're going to have policy, then it really has to be across the board and help everybody where it's required. Because we look at accounts, and if they're small bettors and they start to increase their deposits or they're gambling overnight and all the rest of it, then they are relevant. They are relevant. And at the moment, it seems that policy is ignoring them.
How do you balance protecting punters while at the same time advocating for their freedoms?
And also, you know, with regard to making profit as a company, you know, because people will put that, so you can say
yeah, of
that
course.
as well. You know, that will be thrown at me as well. Well, the bottom line is not just my own personal view on life, which has always been to allow people to bet with me to a level that they can afford, such that they remain a customer of mine forever. Not just for now, not just for 2 weeks or a week or 6 months or something like that. Once you allow somebody to overextend themselves, you basically lose them. They become a non-customer to you, and morally, it's not right. And it's not just me, it's everybody that works with me. They don't want to be involved, or wouldn't want to involve themselves in anything that they thought could be suspect or clear cases of gambling related harm. They wouldn't want to work for me. It's as simple as that. And I, as policy for myself, I mean, I abandoned gaming products on my website. I was making a nice 6-figure sum out of my gaming products every year. No risk, no bother, no, you know, I was making money every month out of that product. But it is inherently a different product from the betting side. And I was hearing the odd stories from punters, mutual punters of the gaming site that I had, and which was run by a third-party company, and my own website, and their behavior was entirely different in different case, you know, with the 2 different companies. And I'm afraid that, you know, these days, gaming and betting, as in sports betting, have been lumped together as one product, even though the Gambling Commission admits that that is a nonsense. They still pursue it as policy, of course. Going back to my original point, they're just trying to reduce the overall level of gambling, and this is just a good way of doing it. So they lump in roulette in with having a bet on the horses. They're not the same. You know, bet on the horses, you're going to have to think, look at the form, bit of study, all of a sudden you might have anything between 5 to 15 minutes before you have another bet. And there's a good level of pause or delay. And if you have a bet in the football, it might be 90 minutes before you find out if you won or lost. And so, whereas on a roulette wheel, you're going to be spinning away multiple times in a minute. And I'm afraid these products, they're not the same. And the second product, which is gaming, is far more insidious, is far more dangerous. But today's Gambling Commission fails to, it recognizes it, but fails to act in a time when, as Chris will tell you, digital wallets are entirely possible, even for small companies like mine. By comparison to Bet365, I am tiny. But digital wallets are possible for companies with both platforms, with a gaming platform and with a sports betting platform, and therefore it is possible to split the two up. Rhodes says that, oh no, people can bet on this and they can bet on that, so we have to treat it as all one product. Again, a lie, because he has to know as the regulator that we can split the products up easily. We can license them differently, so you have two different licenses, and we can have digital wallets to deal with the problem. But he doesn't want to go there. So this all argues to my central point that all he is about, and his policy advisors and his chairman, is reducing the totality of gambling in the United Kingdom. And everybody that wants to bet safely and all the rest of it, can go hang.
Geoff Banks is talking about this. William Woodhams from Fitzgerald has talked about it. I'm pretty certain that Ben Keith has talked about this quite a bit from Star Sports as well. They're three of the biggest independent bookmakers in the UK, Chris. But I don't hear the CEOs of Flutter or Etain coming out and making this point or standing up to fight for their customers' rights. Why are they not doing that? And why is there no distinction between what is clearly something that can be very addictive? I'm sure there are people watching this who enjoy playing online roulette, and you do you. That's great if you enjoy it, and I'm sure, hopefully you make money from it. But that's random. It's designed to impact the lizard part of your brain and get you going. You can carefully consider and listen to various different information, various different experts about a horse racing bet, and your bet will probably be driven by price. That's a skill-based bet. You can make money from it. So why is it not split?
Well, I take slight issue with what Geoff said about them wanting to reduce the overall amount gambled, because since affordability checks have come in, slots have gone through the roof and betting has gone down. So betting on sports, betting on racing, post-inflation is down about 20%. Slots is way, way up.
Why is that?
It's because of the way people bet slots. It's a way you lose a little bit often. So you slowly lose your money. It's not about, you could lose 20 quid, 30 quid a day and never reach an affordability limit. Whereas on racing, you go in, you have £1,000 on a horse, you lose that in one day, you probably get checked that you've lost £1,000. But you might the next day win £1,000. On slots, you won't. If you keep playing loads of slots at even a low level, sort of 10p a spin or whatever, so you're a low level gambler, you will end up losing more than a racing gambler that's got a little bit of skill. But the variance in what you do betting on sports and racing means you will get a check, and that's what's been happening. People that bet higher stakes but don't lose as much, or possibly even win, having these affordability checks. People that play on roulette and slot machines are not getting checked so much. So it works for the big companies. They've shifted the risk. What's happening is the margins on racing, the margins on sports bets have gone up. They're shutting accounts of winning customers and bigger customers. So they're keeping these sort of customers that bet on sports, that bet on ACCAs, that lose small amounts regularly, but the bigger punters can't get a bet on. And they're probably the people that actually won't lose as much in the long run.
So what you're saying, Chris, is, and I accept you're right, is what you're saying is that it is essentially a failure of regulation, because the affordability checks are hitting the people who bet on sports, but not hitting the people who bet on gaming. So and the companies, of course, part of the growth in the companies is basically because companies like Flutter and companies like Entain are flowing their customers into the gaming products, and they're not being checked as assiduously as what they do in sports betting. And that, to me, sounds like a very clear failure of regulation.
Absolutely. I mean, you see, whenever the new figures come out, I put them on Twitter. Look, slots through the roof, betting down. And that's been the effect of this. And also, I think probably some of the big companies' policy is we'll throw in more checks on sports gamblers, on people that are sort of losing a little bit or winning a little bit, just to get them out. And that's another sort of, it's given companies a cover to sort of ask for more information and get rid of customers by having this sort of, oh, we've got to do it because we're regulated by the Gambling Commission. And they never really tell you why they're asking for this information.
So if you're capable of, if you're a savvy enough punter who's capable of beating the SP, but you're not necessarily winning, maybe you're breaking even, but you can beat the SP on a Friday night at Dundalk, they don't want you because you can win. So they want to root you out and get rid of you, but they want as many £20 football punters who will then go on to the casino apps as possible.
Yeah, that's the way I think. And the regulation as it stands with affordability checks is helping that. It is certainly not stopping. I mean, I think Matt Gaskell at the Northern Gambling Clinic said that the number of people that will actually get caught by the £1,000 a day check was 11% of his people that go to his clinic would lose that much. Most people are losing that are at his clinic are losing like £100 to £300 a month. That's the kind of level, and that's affecting their lives. Because as Geoff was saying earlier, it's to do with how much money you've got. If you've really got no money, you can't afford to lose sort of £100. But if you've got, you know, if you run your own business and you've got stacks of money and you want to have a big bet on Cheltenham or something, this is stopping you. The regulations are stopping those people, but not the people that have got nothing and really can suffer.
The point about the Betting and Gaming Council levels that you alluded to, that they've recently come out with this new industry code, these levels, the Gambling Commission have already countered that by saying, don't worry, this is going to drop. So, you know, the bar that the BGC have set it now is, you know, will be dropped by the Gambling Commission. So this will capture an awful lot more gamblers than the BGC hope it will in 2025. They've already stated this. As far as the BHA is concerned, the BHA is not flush with Andrew Black type characters. It's fairly poorly led. It's slow off the mark. It hates being regulator on regulator. It has historically, although it is, it will discuss matters with the likes of Corals and that kind of thing with regard to racing and racing products and that kind of thing. It's very slow to, and has almost no involvement whatsoever with betting and punters. And these are the people that are most directly affected by affordability checks. They have historically had nothing to do whatsoever with punters and their concerns. Only inspired industry leaders like Martin Crillis and Nevin Truesdale have actually recently seen the threat to racing long before the BHA had even opened their mouths. The BHA should have been screaming the place down about the threat to their industry and to the people that work within the industry and to the threat to everybody that loves horse racing and dog racing, but has been very slow off the mark. But I'm afraid that you'll have to look into the very structure of the BHA, how it is, formed, how people are put in charge and everything else like that. They're not an inspired body and never ever have been an inspired body. So they've been messing about with the whip at a time when they should have been screaming their place down over affordability checks and things like that. But that is where we are. And even now, they should be attacking these measures, but they're not. They say, oh, we're having discussions in the background. Well, that's just a nonsense, because it's very clear from recent pods that Rhodes and Tim Miller, these zealots, are pursuing what they want to do, regardless of what punters think. regardless of what horse racing thinks, regardless of what greyhound racing, they will pursue these measures because they are all about one word, and that is harm. It's harm, this phantom harm, that it's some massive umbrella that we're all living under, and everybody's, you know, everybody's suffering. It's not true. There's no evidence for it whatsoever. Everything's based on surveys. And I think, you know, it might be quite useful to, you know, to query Dan on this point, because of course, you know, they are, the commission have recently revamped the way they look at problem gambling, the way that they measure problem gambling.
Dan, take it away.
Yeah, I think that's a very salient observation, because for the last, since 2012, the rate of gambling participation and the rate of harmful gambling in this country has been measured by the NHS within the NHS Health Survey, which is a gold standard instrument or vehicle for measuring health. From this summer, that moves to something called the Gambling Survey for Great Britain, which is the Gambling Commission's own proprietary survey. And it is methodologically different, and the Commission admits that it's likely to result in higher levels of problem gambling. Now, that's problematic in its own right, because the Gambling Commission is planning to publish rates around gambling harm that it thinks may be overstated. I think that's questionable. But secondly, the thresholds being used in the affordability checks, if you go to the white paper or go to the consultation documents, the Gambling Commission says, we have calculated these by reference to the problem gambling rate. So if you increase the problem gambling rate by artifact of survey methodology, as the Gambling Commission plans to do, and they're planning to increase it by about 10 times, so go from 0.25% of the population to about 2.5% of the population, what will happen to the affordability checks? As Geoff has already said, they're going to come down from where the code is to much lower levels. Now, if they genuinely calculated these off the problem gambling rate, and if they genuinely believe, which they don't, but let's just pass that, if they genuinely believe that the problem gambling rate they're going to publish is correct, then we will see those affordability thresholds fall even further. That, you know, there's no way, if they don't believe, if they're not going to reduce them, well, they don't have much faith in their new figure. This new survey, which they'll publish in July, also has figures on suicide attempts, domestic violence, use of food banks, cutting back on essentials, lots of fairly unpleasant things, relationship breakdown, mental health breakdown. They're putting these figures out there in the knowledge they are likely to be untrue. What that does to the debate on gambling is you know, I can't even begin to imagine, because if you look at the hysteria around gambling, when the official rate of problem gambling is 0.25% in Britain, what's it going to be like when it's 2.5%? And then, you know, and if it's 2.5%, that probably means it's close to 4.5% of people who gamble. And then you add in the at-risk categories. So it's coming back to that. What the Gambling Commission is doing is really planning to drop the motherload of anti-gambling statistics into the middle of the debate on gambling market reform in the summer.
Can you give me the problem gambling percentage again?
So the current official statistic is 0.25% if we use the problem gambling severity index instrument. 0.25 of the population aged 16 and over. The new figure from the Gambling Commission, the figure that came out of the experimental stages was 2.5% of people aged 18 and over. So it's not quite comparable, because one's 16 years plus and one 18 years plus, but it's going from 0.25% as a headline measure to 2.5%. We think, because that was the number in the experimental stages, and there's no reason to believe it's going to be any different in the final survey, which is published in July.
Well, just indulge me in a bit of whataboutism. There's thousands of people who go racing every single week, and there's obviously a lot of people, millions in fact, who enjoy gambling. There's also a lot of people who enjoy consumption of alcohol. I like to have a drink. My father was an alcoholic. Geoff likes it. I know what alcoholism is. I know how damaging it can be, and it can be brutal and destructive, and it can tear families apart. I'm sure that gambling addiction can do the same. You can say the same thing for somebody who's addicted to sugar, for example, or sex. Addiction is addiction is addiction. But alcohol, I would say, is very damaging. If you're saying that the official statistic for number of people who are actually addicted to gambling in the United Kingdom is 0.2%, then I'm drawn to the NHS's own figures for alcohol addiction, which is where the whataboutery comes in. 4% of the population of the United Kingdom are alcoholics. 24% engage in binge drinking. But the cost to the NHS per year is £3.5 billion for alcohol-related treatments. So if this is coming in for 0.2% of the population, what do you think they're going to do when it's 2.4 million people and 4% of adults who are actually full-blown alcoholics?
Yeah, I just have to correct you there, Emmet, because it's that's 0.25% problem gamblers. That's not addiction. So addiction would be something like gambling disorder, and that would be about less than half of that, about half of that. So if you're looking at gambling disorder or addiction, according to the NHS Health Survey, it's around about 0.1% of the population.
0.1% is
with a gambling
addicts.
Yeah, which would be comparable with alcohol use disorder, for example. Problem gambling is not a clinical category. It's a category that's subclinical that says, you know, you are gambling is causing adverse things to happen in life. That's not the same as addiction. I suppose it could be the similar thing is, you know, in alcohol you have something called hazardous drinking. You're drinking too much, versus alcohol use disorder. You are reliant on alcohol. You have a dependency. Okay.
Yeah.
Noting, Emmet, that, you know, with all these gambling clinics that are springing up everywhere, that they're struggling to get people in the door. These new gambling clinics, they're literally struggling to get people in the door. So they're inflating the figures of so-called problem gamblers, and yet the figures at these NHS clinics is derisory.
Geoff, you're not suggesting for a second that the medical industry, the pharmaceutical industry would weaponize addiction treatment and then inflate numbers in order to get more funding and get more people in? No, that would never happen.
No, they did so well for us at COVID. I wouldn't be suggesting that at all. I would point out to people who do gamble. One of the important, you know, things that we deal with as an operator, to give you an operator thing, when we look at individuals, when we analyze individuals in it for risk factors that we have, the number of risk factors that we are now being asked to consider would mandate the closure and is mandating the closure of accounts that in the past would literally have been, you know, gambling without any problem. And you know, for example, if you had a CCJ against you, we'd have to have a debate in our office as to, if there's a CCJ against it, how recent was it? Has it caused any, you know, any issues? Have they been bankrupt in the past? These kind of things. If you're a pensioner and you don't have a regular income, how can you prove that you can afford to gamble? And all of these many factors. If you're a single, you know, you're a single person or a housewife or a house husband, you don't have a regular income. How are these people in today's gambling commission proposed plans going to be able to keep their accounts, be able to prove that they can continue to keep betting? It's to me, it's, you know, it's a daily, you know, I get, you know, reports from the office as to things that they've talked about, people that they've talked about. And in so many cases, it comes down to they become a risk. It becomes a risk to consider somebody that's got a CCJ against them, for example, or who lives in Coronation Street as opposed to living in, you know, in a nice house in Sunningdale. All of these factors we are now being asked to consider by the modern day gambling commission. People that, by the way, have bet in many cases for decades without issue.
That was one of the things that really disturbed me, that people are being adversely affected based on where they live, which just seems like an outrageous discrimination.
Yeah, that's what it is. It's discrimination. All of these arguments saying that are taking the ability of people to govern their own lives, to make decisions based on what they know about their personal circumstances, all being taken away from them. Sorry, Dan.
There are sins of commission and there are sins of omission. And I think one of the sins of commission that needs to be pointed out is that the Gambling Commission has actively approved funding for some of the worst, most misleading research we've ever seen. And I'll give you one example. This came from the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, which received funding from approved by the Gambling Commission. They claimed 1.4 billion pounds of costs because of gambling, but that was based on the idea that you're an at-risk gambler if you've won £500 over the course of 2 years and you're economically inactive due to ill health. Just a made-up thing. There's no evidence.
What does that mean?
It means that according to the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, if you've won £500 gambling and you're not working because you have bad health, you must be an at-risk gambler.
So you won 500 quid on a lucky 15, but you're battling cancer, so you can't work, therefore you're a problem gambler.
According to the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. And this was funded with the Gambling Commission's approval. So that's one thing. The Gambling Commission has actually approved funding for an awful lot of really bad, agenda-driven anti-gambling studies. And when you ask them about this, they say, well, it's not our job to check the quality of these things, which is an important... They've given out £90 million in 4 years. Not all of it to research, a lot of it to treatment, which has been well spent. But a lot of it's gone into very, very bad research. And the Gambling Commission washes its hands of it and says nothing to do with us, which is shocking, really. The sin of omission in all of this, as well, is that actually, if you go to the Health Service data archive, some interesting things pop up. So we know, as PHE found, that if you're a problem gambler, you are far more likely to suffer from depression. Okay, so that's understood, and that's important. We should take steps to reflect that risk in policy.
Absolutely.
We also find that if you're a recreational gambler, so if you're a non-problem gambler, your risk of depression is lower than if you're a non-gambler. Okay. In fact, repeated studies have found that if you're a gambler, you have better odds of enjoying good mental health than if you're a non-gambler. Now, it's not saying it's causal. There could be all sorts of things going on there, but the same is true when you're looking at the harm statistics. Yes, problem gamblers have higher risk of depression, but is it because of the gambling? Maybe a bit, maybe a lot, maybe nothing at all. Okay, but the point is here, it gets ignored a lot. There are benefits to gambling. There are benefits to gambling when you lose as well. It's not about you win money, you're fine. You lose money, you're not. People do this and have been doing it for millennia for a reason, because it serves a purpose in their lives. It gives them enjoyment, social connection, or the mental stimulation of playing games or thinking about bets. And that is hardly ever discussed. And in fact, it's suppressed when it comes out in things like health surveys, because the Gambling Commission chooses what gets published and what does not.
I read an excellent book by David Lee Priest a number of years ago, Against the Odds and the Betting Edge. He's a psychologist, David Lee Priest, and he talked about how pretty much every single society, every single culture that has existed, every empire, people engaged in gambling. And there's recorded history of that. And even back in stone tablets, there is examples of gambles. But people gamble every single day. If you decide to go for that job promotion, you're taking a gamble. You board that flight, you go after the love of your life. If you think that she's the one for you, you're taking a gamble. Can I just ask you before you go, I've seen a lot of researchers talk about anti-gambling campaigning on X. I follow a few of them, and I challenged one of them one day about the fact that she never tweets anything positive about gambling or the positive aspects of gambling. What research has found, mental health benefits, for example, likelihood of having depression if you're a recreational gambler is lower for whatever reason. That's something that I would have thought a psychologist or researcher would be very, very interested to explore and talk about. You mentioned £19 million being given by the Gambling Commission to fund some of this research. So how much grifting is going on? Because there's a whole lot of grifting in the world, but how much grifting is going on to produce this stuff?
£19 million worth.
So no,
19 million.
The total figure was 90 million, 90. An awful lot of that went to treatment, and I think treatment providers generally
90
million in 4 years. These are regulatory settlement funds. So when in lieu of fines, operators agree to pay money to where the Gambling Commission chooses. A lot of that's gone to treatment providers, and I think that money has been well spent. It's important work and needs supporting. I don't have the figures off my top of my head, but it's quite a considerable number. It's several millions of pounds have been spent on research that is frankly verging on the fraudulent. It's also been spent on disseminating the research. So I won't say who, but Geoff can probably guess. But the Gambling Commission has given, we think, about £1.5 million to a activist charity, and that activist charity is actively promoting statistics that even the Commission will say are wrong. Both in public, in Parliament, and in schools, and that is funded with the approval of the Gambling Commission.
I can't think who that charity would be. Difficult. I'll have a think about it. It'll come to me eventually.
Who could it possibly be? I wonder. Whoever could it be?
It does argue the question. The serious point is, why is the Gambling Commission shouldn't be funding anybody that is putting out material that is either false or portraying the industry in an unfair light. After all, they do represent the gambling industry. So if they are aware that their money is being used for political campaigning as opposed to treatment, looking after people and dealing with the issues associated with problem gambling, if they are using it for political lobbying, the question is, why are they doing that? Should they be doing that?
I'll make one more point before I drop off. In 2022, in that same document I mentioned earlier that we got under the Freedom of Information Act, the Gambling Commission actually wrote, an officer wrote there, really, we should be studying the benefits of gambling as well as the costs, as well as the harms. And we should try to understand, to get that rounded cost-benefit analysis, rather than just a cost analysis. And then he wrote, but to do that would be politically awkward. And then he wrote, and if the Gambling Commission funded research into benefits from gambling, we would be critical of it. Before they'd even read it, they would be critical. And so you have an asymmetry here where the Gambling Commission will be critical of anything their licensees produce around the benefits of gambling, but is not prepared to be critical of things it knows to be untrue, produced by other bodies, whether it's Public Health England or some of these activist groups or some of these activist researchers. That's an asymmetry, and that's not, going back to its objectives, that's not fair. The Gambling Commission needs to be fair. It needs to be morally neutral on these things. And if it's going to be critical of things its licensees do, which is fair if it warrants it, it should also be prepared to be critical of those who don't like gambling very much. And if it's not prepared to do that, then I think it's going to have a really hard time building trust. And I'll say goodbye now.
Dan Waugh, thank you so much for your insight and your time. Really enjoyed it. Hopefully we'll talk to you again on the Final Furlong podcast. Many thanks for your insight and time today. £90 million is an extraordinary amount of money, and it is going to unearth a few grifters along the way. Chris, there's a couple of questions I want to ask you, but I want to ask both of you, if you don't mind. Again, dumb talking into a microphone, what do I know? But the black market is a thing, and an addict is an addict is an addict. So if you're an alcoholic and you're restricted from going into all the pubs in your locality, you will find a way to get your hands on some alcohol. So if you're a gambling addict, then won't you just go onto the black market and bet as much as you want there?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen it with the GamStop that came out, I think 2019, and people sign up for GamStop so they can't use Gambling Commission licensed sites. And since that's happened, a whole black market has come up where people target those customers online. Anyone Googles non-GamStop, you'll see a huge list of offshore casinos, slot machines where people can just go and bet whatever they want with no checks at all. Now, obviously, the Gambling Commission's aware of that. The GamStop themselves are aware of that. Everybody knows this is happening. It's talked about everywhere. So that's the reality. You can do all you want here to stop harm, but that market is just open. So, they can talk about, oh, we'll take these sites off Google, we'll put cease and desist notice out to different companies, but as soon as you shut one down, another one opens up. They're just, the back end of the website is still there. They just changed the name. So imagine you could even log in with the same details. It's just they've changed the front end of the name of the website. So no amount of stopping this. They can't stop it in China. So I can't imagine how the Gambling Commission here will be able to stop the black market. And I think they kind of moved now to they want to stop the black market at scale. So they want most people gambling here, but the idea is we'll stop a huge at-scale movement. But to me, that doesn't really work, because if the very people you're targeting with things like GamStop and affordability checks, you're telling people that have got a problem, you can't bet at all. We're shutting you out of the market. It doesn't matter if that number is 1% of the British market. If it's all the people that are suffering harm that are going to the black market with no checks, no protections, then that's a serious problem. It's not about the volume, it's about who's going.
It's a question that I've never heard any MPs, Chris, discuss in select committee, throw at the Gambling Commission and say, well, is it not likely that the people who are, the real problem gamblers, those that are seriously ill from gambling, will be the first people directed to the black market? When I say directed, I warned the Gambling Commission in extensive conversations I had with them when we were still talking before GamStop was imposed. And I warned them at the time that the way that GamStop is set up is too draconian. My question to them was, if somebody's circumstances change and they've signed up to GamStop initially, like people do, have signed up for the full 5 years. You know, you're pissed off, you've had a bad day, you've done your money, and you've done your money yesterday and last week and whatever. You go, right, that's it, damn, I'm putting the key in the door, 5 years, I don't want to gamble. 2 weeks later, you've changed your mind. You've come into a few quid, you know, you had a bad night, you were drinking, all the rest of it. And I argued vehemently with nice people at the Gambling Commission at that time and said to them, if you set limits which are too high, and more importantly, have no escape valve, no relief valve, where somebody can turn around to you and say, look, I've reconsidered my position and I want to return to the regulated market. And they said to me, well, how would that work? I said, well, the operators should pay for advice and treatment to people who want to return to the regulated market. That will be paid for by the operators. I'm not talking about teaching them how to have a Yankee or a patent. I'm talking about, have you considered this? How have your circumstances changed? Can you afford to return to gambling? Is it really sensible? What made you give it up in the first place? Now you want to go back into gambling. That kind of research, that kind of discussion with the users, paid for by the operators. I said, you have to have a relief valve. Otherwise, what will happen is, inevitably, they will go to the unregulated market. It's a fact. It's just a click of the mouse. And they refused to accept that argument because they said that we must be seen to do something. And we must be seen to create something that is completely airtight. In other words, they didn't accept my argument that if they didn't have a relief valve, that would be a bad thing for GamStop. And indeed, in my original, they've stopped communicating to me with me in the way that they originally started. But GamStop wrote to me and admitted that they had complained to the Gambling Commission, okay, because they're technically a separate body. They complained to the Gambling Commission about the level of people going to the black market. That they were fully aware of what was going on through Google and these kind of things. They were aware of it. They put it to the Gambling Commission. That's the last I heard about it.
And this is a phenomenon throughout the world. So these black market operators are targeting, because all different countries have this sort of GamStop type thing, and it's a key market for them. So that's the second part of the black market. The other part, obviously, is people that want to get a bet on and can't, the sort of bigger gamblers. But I don't think, the impression I get is that they're not that worried about gambling syndicates and people that want to bet large amounts. It's not really something the Gambling Commission on one hand are concerned about the sort of smaller gambler, but that's why it doesn't make sense to me, the whole affordability check thing. It's kind of contradictory. The bigger gamblers will find a way to get on anyway.
We all know this. You cannot stop people from doing what they want to do. And the black market is the direct resultant of poor regulation or more regulation. And where did this all come from, Emmet? It came from the decade of the Gambling Commission between 2010-ish and 2020, whereas we know they regularly found major operators had flouted the rules and done things wrong and never fined them, never took any licenses away. They didn't act at all. It was actually only until Andrew Rhodes arrived on the park that things changed in the Gambling Commission and they started hitting these operators with huge fines. So they basically got serious in 2020. So up till that point, Andrew Rhodes wasn't doing anything wrong. He was actually doing his job. The problem is that he's gone a lot further than that when he didn't really need to. All the Gambling Commission needed to do was make sure that the bookmakers enforced the measures that they already had in place since 2010, around about 2010. It wasn't in 2005. They started introducing deposit limits, they started introducing timeouts and all sorts of other measures, but they weren't implementing them because the Gambling Commission wasn't serious about regulating them at that time. It was very laissez-faire. You know, it was a very easy form of regulation. That all changed with Andrew Rhodes, and he was right up to that point to change him and to fine these operators roundly for failing to follow their own code, to make sure that people were properly protected on their own, based on their own code. But he's gone a lot further than that, introducing more and more regulations based on more and more bullshit surveys. And I don't believe in any of these surveys, Emmet. You know, I don't believe that, you know, when I'm told about that there's 2 suicides a day, I look at the Office of National Statistics and I say, and I ask the question, why do the Office of National Statistics, looking at coroner's reports where gambling is mentioned, say there's 1 suicide a year? Now that's bad enough, but I'm afraid it's not preventable. It isn't a preventable number. The argument from the anti-gambling lobby when you talk about things like that is that, oh no, gambling is not mentioned in the coroner's report because it's in some way kept out of the investigation. Well, I don't understand that argument at all, because if I lost one of my children to suicide, I would be sure to be going into coroner's report and telling the coroner everything that happened to me that could possibly have affected my loved one. I would not hesitate to reveal everything about it. And the Office of National Statistics have been diligently compiling these statistics, and I don't understand why what is factual, professional coroners' courts are being ignored in all of these arguments.
Why is anybody believing establishment media anymore? I don't want to put the Alex Jones tinfoil hat on, but you do realize they've lied to you about basically everything for decades. Every major story that you were told, every single thing those people in nice suits and lovely dresses with their smiles, everything they told you turned out to be very different afterwards. And why would this be any different?
They only want to put bad news out. I landed in Heathrow the other day from something. They walked through. There was no delays. It was, you know, the security area was empty. But the last time airports were mentioned, which was just over a week ago, the whole airport was clogged up and people waiting 2 and 3 hours and all this kind of stuff. They only want to put out bad news. You know, good news doesn't sell anything. It's not interesting. Well, who cares if people having happy lives and, you know, gambling and enjoying themselves? I've been to York this week. You know, I've seen race girls in front of me and engaged. You know, this is one of the reasons it's a hobby for me, going racing these days. But, you know, you see that you experience the interaction. This is the part I love, the interaction between you and proper, you know, people having a bet, punters, 5s, 10s, 50s, whatever their bet is, 2,000 on this, 50 on that, 5 each on this. But their enjoyment is quite evident. They're enjoying being out in the ring, looking around at the different prices, looking for the best odds and all this kind of stuff. And when they win off you, the big smiles on their faces as the money is counted out. They love all that. So this is one of the reasons why I'm so, you know, fighting these actions so hard. It isn't about my personal worth in life or my personal profits, because, you know, at the end of the day, I'm experienced enough. I can move my website anywhere I want in the world and set myself up because I have that level of experience, lawyers, and everything else. I can do that tomorrow. So it isn't about that. It's because I believe that what they're doing right now, Emmet, is wrong. It's fundamentally wrong. It's driving people in the wrong direction. You are moving the problem on to an environment that's the last place in life you want to be. And I mean, I'll make this last point to you, that the one person, the worst gamblers in the world, the pathological gamblers, you know, the real problem gamblers, the place you want them actually betting, and you can't stop them, the place you want them actually betting is in the regulated market, where there's at least some control over what they do. You can at least come to some kind of an agreement over what they can spend and everything else like that. No, you're not trying to make profit out of these people. So anybody sitting out there going, oh, that's Geoff, just wanting to try and make money out of somebody who's very vulnerable, you're not going to stop them gambling. But it's a lot better if they're betting with my company in a controlled fashion than what it would be with AsiaBet. You know, and that, I'm afraid, is the reality. And until politicians and regulators get that under their skin and understand that you're not going to stop people gambling, you have to find a way to negotiate your way through the problem. And that is by, you know, we would talk to the people that have, that we, rather than banning them and shutting them down as we're currently doing right now, that is absolutely counterproductive. Not to my profits, it's counterproductive to them as people, as individuals with a problem. We have to help these people, and we have to help them through. They should be allowed to gamble at very low levels in the regulated markets. At least, the argument that you're just going to stop them by turning them off is naive to the point of moronic.
Well, I think that was one of the things in the Gambling Commission notes, wasn't it, that the bookmaker or the gambling operator might have to end their relationship with the customer if they fail a test or whatever. But you're literally just washing your hands on it then. Yeah. This big company, they've seen someone's got a problem. They just said, goodbye, it's not our problem anymore. Off you go. I mean, what do they think is going to happen to that person?
I don't think they care.
That's the worry. They don't care about the effect of the measures, the impact. That's why, I'm so against some of these anti-gambling lobbyists. They don't care about what happens to people who are turned off or banned from betting. And I'm not talking about restrictions here, and I understand that is a very big issue, and that's something that perhaps we can talk about on another day. But in terms of vulnerable people, they cannot be stopped, but they have to be kept in the regulated market as far as is possible. And the last thing you want to do, when they go over when they disappear off into the black market and they're still gambling, that is a failure of regulation. It's because the regulations are too draconian and not flexible enough to recognize this is what we actually want to happen to these people. We want them to keep gambling, and we want them to keep gambling in the regulated market because we have to accept one simple premise: you're not going to stop them. It's like turning around to saying, it's a different thing, Emmet, from some people who drink in, pub. You have to walk from one pub to another. It might be 300, 400, 500 yards apart. But in gambling, it's just a click of the mouse. You've got to wait for to go to Tesco online to order your shopping into your house. It's just a click of the mouse. To go to God Odds, which you can open an account with, based in not Kanawaki, but the other place where people are all UK customers are active. You can open an account with God Odds. I've got an account with God Odds. I experimented with it, opened it up, place bets, deposit money, all that kind of thing. They're not licensed to do business in the UK. They're freely talked about here. And I have a pal of mine that works for me and all the rest of it. He's owed, I think, the guts of £20,000 from God Odds, because as soon as he won, they ain't paying.
Why, though, Chris, as we come towards the end of this, why is all of that misinformation being allowed, and what is the fundamental goal of it? What are the overall policies they want to implement?
I can't speak for everyone that's involved in that. I imagine that the campaigners that have lost people through suicide, they will feel very strongly they don't want that to happen to anyone else. So that is their desire, and I understand that. I can't really argue with that. I'd probably feel the same. But it's the sort of the government bodies and the regulators. I just feel that they've got themselves into a position where perhaps there's activists there. Certainly some of the academics that are involved also appear to be activists. And I don't know how you can have that independent research. So on the one hand, you've got people not taking money from Gambling Aware, because that's industry funded by the bookmakers. But on the other hand, you're funding these universities to do studies, but some of those people appear to be very anti-gambling and will even post on social media things that appear to me to be kind of one-sided. So I think people have got entrenched positions, and there's a lot of egos involved, and no one's actually sort of taking a step back and saying, okay, so if we do all these things, are we actually going to be any better off? Are we actually going to be helping the people that we're trying to help, which is someone who potentially might, take their own life or ruin their life through excessive gambling? And I think that I don't think we'll end up in that position. I think we'll end up in a worse position. But I think there's so many entrenched positions, there's so many sort of arguments that it's not really getting anyone. It's drifting on year after year after year. with nothing resolved. Like the affordability checks are now like another pilot scheme, and it's just sort of slowly changing the environment, but it's not going to shift the needle at all on harm, I don't think. And I can't speak for what everyone's motivations are, but I think they're probably everyone's personal opinion has ended up with this kind of messed up situation.
Is there something more nefarious going on, Chris?
I don't know. I mean, it's either a catalogue of errors, plus you've got these tech companies who obviously want more and more data and open banking and all that sort of thing. So it's either a catalogue of errors that is led to what I think will be a worse situation for the gambling people suffering from harm, or, as you're suggesting, something more towards a social credit type system where, you know, your bank's monitored, or whatever it would be, a digital currency is monitored, and you're given that, and if you do bad things, you're scored against, and all
like
that sort of thing. Yeah, but I can't speak. I don't know whether it's that or not. I really don't know.
There's an enormous, you know, today's politician is not the same breed of politician. They're not as well paid. I suppose most of them in the past, basically, they were sort of stealing a living, literally. But these days, of course, they're, you know, examined, they're poorly paid. And if you look into the, you know, the history of many of the modern politicians like, say, for example, Matt Hancock, who found himself in charge of an entire country during a major pandemic. Well, Matt Hancock's never done anything in business whatsoever, nothing. Worked in Conservative Party office, that kind of thing. Jumped on the FOBT bandwagon, which is what they do. They jump on causes. He jumped on the FOBT bandwagon. That went well for him. And he found himself suddenly being elevated to a position of power, of great power, that he was simply not qualified to hold. And when you look at Stuart Andrew knows the square root of nothing about gambling and about punters. It's clear he doesn't bet. And yet I saw him interviewed, I think it was by Matt Chapman, and he was saying, I find it extraordinary. People are telling me that they have to give identification to bookmakers to open up an account. Well, you know, this is the kind of, you know, ignorance from the man that, you know, we are, of course, mandated to request 2 pieces of identification, or otherwise we cannot open the account at all. So, you know, but they are very, you know, they have no business experience. They're very low-level businessmen. They're poorly paid, and at any cause these days they're jumping upon it. And even some of the most ridiculous things, you know, that we're seeing these days are, you know, having to come out with announcements as they did this week that they you know, you shouldn't be teaching children under 9 sex education at school. For God's sake, how do we even get to a situation where you actually have to turn around and say that? So, but in terms of gambling, we've been led by a succession of gambling ministers, most of whom, not all, John Whittingdale, he knew a lot about gambling. Paul Scully was obviously a very smart man, but they were quickly moved on. And the last 2, Chris Phil, who literally jumps on any cause, and again, has got no business experience. The same with Stuart Andrew, no business experience whatsoever, knows nothing about gambling. It's clear he knows nothing about gambling. And he is always going to accept the advice of people like Andrew Rhodes and Ben Dean. That's essentially policy is created by those people. And you hear it from Andrew Rhodes when he admits tacitly that basically all these policies are coming from the Gambling Commission themselves. You know, it isn't coming from government, it comes from the Gambling Commission. They discuss it with DCMS, they kick it around like a football, and they present it up to the gambling minister, and he just goes, okay, fine, we'll do that. And it's turned out to be a nightmare for him, an absolute nightmare. I have very little sympathy for him because he took the job on. That's what he wants to do. He took the gambling job, knows nothing about it. I have no sympathy for him doing that. But essentially, he's been given something, and he's had the racing people screaming at him, those that understand the problem, people like Martin Cruddas, screaming at him and saying, you are literally destroying an entire cottage and an essential British way of life here. That's what you're doing. And that's where we find ourselves these days. So we have a little official in Birmingham with his ideas of how he's going to change the world, not respecting people's personal freedoms, coming out with nonsense like open banking was bad enough. I mean, that was just lunacy. Open banking is lunacy. But he actually came out with things like single customer view. Andrew Rhodes came out in a speech, Emmet, and said, I will not accept operators dragging their feet on single customer view, in one of his speeches. In his speech, and single customer view is where you give your data to Entain, and it is shared amongst all the gambling companies, so we all have an overview of what your finance is in your line. And as Chris will tell you, what they are doing with the data is they are profiling you, profiling where you live, what you spend your money on. I see you get your car serviced in Mercedes. Okay, that's all right. You know, they can profile you to the nth degree. That's why these companies are drunk on the data. They're not opposing any of these measures, the Flutters, the Entains, the Bet365s. None of them are opposing this. They are drunk on the data being provided to them because it's presenting them an open goal to more profit. An open goal to more profit. It's what big companies have always wanted. They want you to fill out their surveys. They want you to give access to your data, everything else like that. So they can, you know, you go on booking.com. Next time you go on, you might be on bigtips.com the next day, and you'll see a little sign come up and it'll say for a hotel that you were looking at yesterday on booking.com. All these algorithms and clever things that people like Chris work on, the machine learning. This is what they do these days. All AI. It's all about data. They want this data, and this is why little bookmakers like me, with my online operation, are finding myself cruelly exposed and trying to represent my customers and potential customers of mine and those people in gambling, because this is all an anathema to me. I don't understand it, but I virtually stand alone. Myself, William Woodham, Ben Keith, we virtually stand alone in opposing measures, because you hear nothing from the Peter Jacksons of this world. You hear nothing from the Denise Coates of this world representing their own customers. And as a final point, Emmet, they were fools over FOBTs, these gambling companies. They were fools. They denied it. They knew they were causing extensive harm. They denied it. And then in the end, they were castrated. They were regulated because they refused to accept unilateral cuts to the stakes and FOBTs. And right now, they're being equally foolish in grabbing all the data that they possibly can to the objections of their own customers. And no business does well that ignores their customers. There's no future in it. There's no long-term future in poor customer service and in not respecting their values. And I'm afraid this is a second example. And, you know, I listened recently to a guy called Andrew Black. Andrew Black was one of the smart minds that invented Betfair. And he is against all of these affordability measures because he understood the customer. The original Betfair, when it came around, was a phenomenal product, incredibly dangerous to companies like mine. They were incredibly smart. They did smart things all the time. People like Andrew Black, you know, and his partner, that was a fantastic business and a fantastic business model that listened to their customers. And it morphed, it changed once that ownership expired and they started to get other industry heads from other big companies, like Brian Corcoran and all the rest of it. With his ideas, it changed. They stopped listening to customers, and look what's happened to them. Betfair is literally destroyed now. It's destroyed as a product.
Chris, you've shared some very alarming turnover data on the Betfair exchange. I think the turnover for the guineas you were talking about off the top of my head, that 10 years ago it was astronomical, and this year it's big money, but it's nothing anywhere. It's not even a fraction of what it used to be. I
think it's after inflation down about 60% on British horse racing since 2019, but on things like Australian racing, dog racing, and cricket in particular, it's still as high as it's ever been. But horse racing, British horse racing, is just gone. I'm not quite. I think it's obviously the affordability checks.
Yeah.
So people, I guess, dog racing people bet less, so it's a lot of people betting less money. But horse racing has just fallen off a cliff.
But if you are a customer who is betting with Betfair or Kaluki or Fitzdares or Geoff Banks, guess what? You are contributing to the levy, therefore you're contributing to horse racing in Britain. It's ultimately you are helping to fund it. You might have lost a tenner on that 6-4 favourite that I might have tipped, sorry. But at least there's some contribution going. if people are so frustrated that they can't get their bets on anymore and they're being restricted into oblivion, that they turn to something they don't fully understand in order to get their bets on, i.e. the black market, you can get your bet on. Geoff made the point, are you actually going to get paid? That's a risk you're going to have to explore for yourself. But it's of no advantage to British racing. You're betting on the product, but there's no funding going to them.
But it's not just that. It's that British racing is just really for British customers. I mean, that's what most of it is. So the liquidity for British racing is going because of the affordability checks. Whereas for me now, most of my betting is on other sport because there's global liquidity on that does sort of feed into exchanges and feed into what people can offer, what even the bookmakers can offer. But racing is just, because it's dying down so much, because it's a British product for British customers, I'm really struggling to see the future for it unless we can turn this around very quickly. Because people like myself will just move to sport. I mean, I much preferred, like, racing is the ultimate conundrum for me to solve and to try and work on, but sports betting is kind of what you have to do if that's where the liquidity is.
Well, that's a point that, Geoff, that you were making, I'm pretty sure, when you were on the Final Furlong podcast a year ago. I think you might have talked about it on the morning line back in the day as well, that when you would go outside a high street bookmakers, it was all racing. You go past a high street bookmaker now or go onto any major website and it's all about football, cricket, NFL, golf. It's everything but racing.
So if you go to the ice show, I go to the ice show, I used to go to the ice show, I don't know if it's moving now. I used to go to the ice show every year, and you've got a lot of the products there that are being on display are not including British racing. You know, not even a feature. They're all sports, football, all this kind of stuff.
That's the big gambling conference in London.
Yeah. But the other sports, I'm afraid, and this is regrettable. I do love British racing. I love it. I love greyhound racing. I love watching the dogs. And I grew up going to Reading Dogs. You know, my first example of learning how to, you know, make books and all the rest of it, coupled odds and all these kind of things was at Reading Dogs. And you know, but the fact remains is that the other products have improved. They've upped their game. You know, the Premier League football used to be First Division or whatever it was used to be called. I can't remember. But they've moved their product on. Champions League, the NFL, all these products, Indian Premier League. These are all Formula One. These are all major advances in what, you know, in how sport is evolving. It's got better in all of these products. Racing hasn't gone that way. Racing's Grand National audience has gone from 15 million down to 6 million. Oh. That's what's the last broadcast of the Grand National went from 15 million to 6 million.
10.5 million people watched it on the BBC 11 years ago. 8.4 million people watched it on Channel 4 the next year, so that's 10 years ago. Last year, 7.5 million people watched it on ITV. This year, 6.1 million people watched it, and we're supposed to celebrate that as some kind of success.
It's a huge drop-off. It's a huge drop-off. But, I mean, it's a different topic. But the fact remains that, you know, we've got the Gold Cup at Cheltenham, the Premier race, because they've split up all the races, because you all have the Ryanair and all the other options for these horses, you rarely get any more than 10 or 11 horses running the Gold Cup, for example. We'd be lucky if we get a 10-runner Derby, for example. This is not what people want to bet on. This is not what people want to see. They want to see a bun fight. They want to see 40 horses in the Grand National. They want to see them falling all over the place. And because I'm afraid this is what engages people. British racing is going in the other direction. Instead of like saying, you know, we need to consolidate, we need to evolve our product, make it better and all the rest of it, bring our field, to make a serious effort to make the field sizes better. You know, they've made some steps recently which are more encouraging, you know, reducing the number of meetings, for example, that take place every day. But the bottom line is that we are lagging behind other sports. And in terms of just as a bookmaker, racing is incredibly expensive as a product to operate. I can't tell you how much money it costs us. You know, streaming rights is an enormous bill that we pay into British racing every single year. It's an enormous figure. The levy, you know, is another factor. There are so many associated costs with British racing that don't apply in the Premier League, don't apply in the Indian Premier League, don't apply in Formula One, that it just makes it difficult to, even though we make profit from it, unquestionably we do. Look at the figures, nice race, Widati will win, everybody happy. But then you get all of these draws that we as bookmakers have to pay. And this is, I think, always going to be a problem for, for British racing, especially with the leadership that they have that doesn't recognise that they need to be fully engaged in punters and betting. You want to find out, if the Grand National's got 6 million viewers this year, as a sport, they want to be looking at it and say, that's a crisis. That's a premium race. That's the best that we offer. That's the most important race. How the hell did we get down to 6 million people? They're handing out awards to ITV the other day, a wonderful product. And it's great that we've got the exposure that we do from ITV. It's been on all week, ITV, and we'll be on again tomorrow on a Sunday. That is fantastic news for racing. We're bloody lucky as a sport. But the bottom line is people are not tuning in to our Grand National. That's not the fault of ITV, I don't think. It's the fault of the product. So all of these things, as a bookmaker, racing is very expensive. And I can imagine, when you talk about Big Core, that they are a little bit ambivalent about the betting product, and the sport can't afford to rest on its laurels when they're looking at these numbers.
You look at the people who are running the sport, Premier Racing, this is going to be a revolution. Premier Racing is going to be the radical change to improve racing. Has it been the radical change? Has your betting turnover increased through Premier Racing, Geoff?
No, but it has, the reduction in the number of meetings, for example, and the reaction. I mean, we had, I don't know if you saw it, but I think the first day I highlighted it at race 1 of the York at the Dante meeting this week. The favourite was returned 18-5. 18-5. Now no self-respecting bookmaker puts 18-5 up on their website. Nobody does that. But it came out 18-5, and I looked at this figure and I tweeted it out to those that might be interested in that kind of thing. This is just an example of what Big Core do these days. It's totally ill-transparent. It is a matter for the Gambling Commission, but they're not interested. They should be looking at this. How is the starting price governed? How is it made up? Who is involved in that? How does it get worked out? It does appear from the way that it is done, because the on-course bookmakers are no longer involved in it, and bears no relation whatsoever to what Betfair is offering at the time, clearly, because there's much bigger margin these days. It appears that they just decide at the end of the race, based on liabilities, that figure, and just mark it down. So it doesn't affect the majority of single bets, as we know, because most of those are at prices. 99% of those bets are at prices, but it affects every multi-bet that people have, all those multi-bets. So just returning it 18-5 instead of 4-1, for example, makes a big difference to their profits. And they're doing that in thousands of races every year.
What you're describing
nobody's asking any questions about that.
That's basically a tote system then. If they do it to the liability and pay out, what they've ended up doing with the SP, if that's how it's worked out.
Well, not really. The tote is governed by there's a rake that there's a rake. What is it, 18, 19%, whatever it is, that's the rake. So that's a fixed figure, and they are supposed to return the residual money. But in this particular case, what's happening is Big Core are basically turning around and saying, well, instead of returning that 6-4, we'll return it 11-8, or some other fancy number under. It makes a colossal difference, Chris, to the multi-bet payouts. People who have been multi-bets, patents, Yankees, doubles, trebles, all this kind of stuff, because they may not all be at prices, and they, so they are effectively in every race, every day, fully in control of what they pay out after the race. After the race, this is the key. They decide the price after the race is over, not before. So nobody's asking any questions as to how it is being made up these days.
So British racing is a diluted product where there aren't as many top class horses in training as there used to be. You have to pay over the odds to go racing. You have to pay ridiculous money to get yourself a burger that you could buy in any fast food place. in any village in the United Kingdom. It would probably be just as nice. And there's some lovely food places at British racecourses, but come on, the prices that are being charged are absolute insanity. All of that then justified that you're paying £8 for a pint of Guinness. This is apparently okay because, well, that's what it costs at an elite sporting event in London. Of course it's going to cost that much at Cheltenham and various other different places. And customers have had enough. And you made this point last year, Geoff, that the attendances for Cheltenham were down, and there was this spin, oh, well, the teacher strike is on, and the rail strike, yeah, it's the rail strike. And you said, no, that's nonsense. And sure enough, a year later, the crowd figures fall off a cliff even further. Anecdotal evidence that more punters, listeners to this show, telling us that they're going to the Dublin Racing Festival, couldn't wait to go there, and that they're going back to the Dublin Racing Festival next year. Plenty of listeners to this show have been in touch via DM to say they're going back to Leopardstown next year. They always went to Cheltenham, and they're not going to go. Carl Hinchy, a hugely influential owner in the sport, has been going to Cheltenham since the early 90s for every single day of the festival, every single year. He said on this show back in January he was going to go to Cheltenham for one day this year, not for all four, and he was only going for the day that his horse was running on Ryanair Chase Day. He's a multi-millionaire, and he was saying there's no value for money.
I'll throw a name at you of one horse that will trigger your mind. Hardy Eustace. If you remember Hardy Eustace running and winning the Champion Hurdle, it was a bun fight of 2 mile specialists, all fantastic horses in their own right, all your direct routes and all these sort of, in the Edgerton Blur era and all this sort of stuff. Edgerton Blur, not in that year, of course. But, it was a fantastic race. It was a fantastic spectacle.
We lost Archibald this week, and he was a huge contributor to that race.
Yeah. So it was a fantastic spectacle to go and watch. 12, 15 runners, and all going all off for their life. These days, what they're celebrating is State Man running against horses 20 pounds inferior to him. And if he'd gone up against Constitution Hill, he would have been beaten 15 lengths anyway. We all know that. So many of these races have become hugely uncompetitive. And we're lucky if we get 2 stars in these top graded events, so that's at least the prospect of a match bet. There's a prospect of a race, whereas in the past there would be a whole buffet. Remember Lord Windermere when he won the Gold Cup? How many marquee horses there were in that race at the time, and all the rest of it that people could go and enjoy. People get it up for that. That's what excites them. That's what they want to see. British racing and racing aficionados are trying to convince people that what they want to do is go see Constitution Hill. Nonsense. The average racegoer is not interested in Constitution Hill unless Constitution Hill's up against Fawcett and a whole load of other fantastic named horses that have won their races in their own rights, and it's going to be a bun fight. That's what people want to see. They want racing. They want it to be competitive. And I'm afraid British racing all too often is just not competitive at the top of the sport. And I'm afraid that's what brings people in. Plus, of course, the other factor, which is the dark underbelly of what racetracks have been doing of late, which is the alcohol thing and the groups of young lads and a focus on these people on drinking, on concerts and all this kind of stuff, which to the older people that go racing, the long-standing members, the aficionados, and we know racing has got that lifeblood of support that it's always enjoyed. They have been marginalised, and that it's now become the plastic cup place where you get a plastic cup. You can pay. I think at Cheltenham I paid £120 for a bottle of champagne, and they gave me 4 plastic cups. That kind of thing is just. No, it's a small thing. But it's what I like to do, for example, and entertain guests of mine when I go racing and that kind of thing. And then you're just giving them something out of a plastic beaker. You're paying all that money, and I've no intention whatsoever of hanging around any racetrack after racing these days, as I used to do in the past, simply because it's too hostile an environment to dwell in. You'd never take your child to the Epsom Derby, for example. It's just too hostile an environment. It's all about the drinking. There's people running around with backpacks pumping out beer in backpacks. And at other racetracks, you see machines selling at Cheltenham. You see machines selling beer. They put a card in, and the cup comes out the bottom with with a pint of beer and all the rest of it. And what is this? Is that this is not what you'll see, for example, if you go to the Arsenal. The Arsenal, you can't go into the main enclosure, into the main arena of Arsenal football ground to watch the game if you've got anything in your hand. You're not allowed to. It's simply not allowed to drink in the main arena and all the rest of it. Consequence, it's a very safe environment for people to go. Racing has become rather unsafe. It's become, Newmarket the other day, it was yet another fight. This time it was in the Coke Park, but it's in the area. A lot of people drinking and everything else like that. So for me, that's the two things that are the biggest turn-off in racing are the drinking culture, the concert culture, if you like, that racetracks sold their souls to, and secondly, the complete lack of competitiveness. At the end of the day, they will force, the Premier League will force Manchester City to play Liverpool twice a year, Arsenal twice a year, Chelsea twice a year. Then they'll play in the Champions League and everything. That's what people want to go watch, because they know every time they're going to watch it, it's going to be a bun fight. And that's what people pay to see. They don't really just, there's all the myopic focus on horses like Constitution Hill, as good as he is. At the end of the day, he's just going to win his races by 100 yards because there are no horses anymore. I don't know where they are.
And I was talking to a friend of mine this morning, who's a very, very good punter, very shrewd punter. He was telling me he's barely placed a bet on the flat this season because of what a nightmare. He was saying it's been nightmarish results, and that he's glad he's just watching and not betting, because if he was, he'd have done his brains on the 2 guineas and definitely done his brains on the French guineas as well. And then what happens in the lock-in? Hawkwing 2.0, except it's not Hawkwing, and it wasn't expected that Audience goes and wins as he does, and it's hard to explain how has that horse improved to the extent that he has. Well done, Rab Havlin. Well done, the Gosden team, but you're scratching your head with that result.
Well, we're
Chris,
already talking about the Derby, aren't we? So we have a horse that was absolutely horrible in the Guineas, and now it's favourite to win the Derby. The same as Augusta Rodin last year was horrible in the Guineas, absolutely horrible, and it went to the Derby and won. And it's just, how can you figure that? Nothing came out of the Derby other than Augusta Rodin last year, so. Maybe just the quality is just no longer there.
Chris, if I had the power, which would probably be a dangerous thing, I don't know what I'd do with it, but if I had the power to elevate you into a position whereby you could actually oversee gambling regulation in the United Kingdom and proper common sense could be applied to restrictions, what would you do? If you were the head of the Gambling Commission, what would you do regarding the proposals that are being made, the things that are being put in front of you? What would be your plan to make gambling safe for people, to balance the two things, but also give British people, Irish people, their actual freedoms to be able to do what they want with their own money?
What I would do is get some sort of similar system to open banking for betting. So you had, when you place a bet with a bookmaker, you have 2 counterparties, the bookmaker and the customer. And for too long, the bookmaker's got all the data on you, and the customer doesn't really have their history of all the bets you place. Like on Betfair, you could probably go on and say, right, how much have I won on horse racing or lost? How much of, all the sports? You can see all the times, you can download all the bets. With most bookmakers, you can't do that. You've only just started to be able to see profit and loss in recent times. On some bookmakers, you can't go back time. So what I would be focusing on is patterns of play data, but giving the user access to that data so that third-party apps and so on could examine that data and give people warnings. Based on millions of bets, you could build a model that say, right, if you're playing, it's obvious things, I guess it would come out with, but you could do this with a machine learning model. If you're playing all night, if you're depositing 10 times in a day and all those sort of things, we can see that, a machine will be able to tell you that is a problem. That is a warning sign. And I think instead of telling people you can't bet, like we were talking about earlier, no, we're shutting you down. I think we need to give the customer the information so that they can make that decision. And every individual bookmaker could use the same system to monitor all their customers in a uniform way. At the moment, different companies have different patterns of play analysis, different ways of doing it. I think there should be a uniform system. So for every bookmaker you log into, you can see your sort of patterns of play information that can give you warning signs. And also, if people consented, this data could then be used for research at the universities and whatever. They could use, I think the last big patterns of play study was 2019. And we don't get access, like a researcher does not get access to all the data. Like I can only see the summary. And I think that's what we're lacking, is no one really knows what's going on. So we're basing decisions like, oh, there should be you lose £1,000 a day, you need to have an affordability check. But what's it based on? It's based on thin air. We need to have a huge amount of data to be analysed so we can actually make a decision based on hard science, not on social science, surveys and all that. We just need a proper study done on what people are actually betting on and how many of those people are then self-excluding or signing up to GamStop. And you can kind of predict that using this kind of system. And that's what I would be focusing on.
Same question for you. If you became CEO of the Gambling Commission, what would you do?
Well, first of all, I agree with Chris. Machine learning is a huge opportunity to analyze people's play. I hate to use the word play when I talk about betting, but to analyze their betting patterns, to try to identify cases that have happened in the past to other users with regard to responsible gambling practices. Number two, the bookmakers are not social workers or psychologists, as we're being called to do right now. Return decision-making into the hands of the individuals, because at the end of the day, the individual has the very best opportunity to govern their own spending. And it's nonsensical to try to make businesses like mine try to mandate or understand if somebody can afford to have a bet with you and all the rest of it. So I think that is a nonsense. And number three, make sure the bookmakers are applying the measures that they have been applying since basically 2010, deposit limits. Make sure that everybody's got a deposit limit set, mandated on opening of an account. And if they've already got an existing account, then everybody should have an established deposit limit that they're comfortable with, that is governable, and which stops them basically from exceeding those limits, making sure exclusion orders are adhered to, making sure the timeouts are respected and reasonable levels and all the rest of it. Over and above that, I don't believe in any of the other measures that are being advocated today. I just believe that if you had stuck to a formula that make sure that the bookmakers were doing those measures, they were already extremely successful, because the numbers of problem gamblers, real problem gamblers in the UK, is actually spectacularly low. Less than 300,000 people in the entire community. There's actually a very, very low number. That's not pathological gamblers, that's problem gamblers. And so that number is artificial, is extremely low. And so the bookmakers actually in the UK, in a market which people are used to gambling and everything else, have actually been very, very successful at what they do. All that's happened over the last few years is that we found out that companies like Entain, like Flutter, like Bet365 have not been applying things that they've been saying they would have been applying. And I'm afraid that's when things start to break down. That's when we all get tarred with an unfair brush, as if we're all, adopting nefarious practices and everything else like that. If the Gambling Commission had if they would simply make sure that we do our job in that regard, without having to go to any extra measures, any of these strange ideas they've got right now, single customer view, open banking, affordability checks, they're all nonsense, absurd. It won't work. They won't deal with the problem. It will simply move it on. So you have to get back to, accepting that, applying the measures that we've already had, that we've already established, making sure that they are applied to that, Emmet, will work. It will keep the figure of problem gambling figure down low, and it will keep people betting in the regulated market. And that, I think, is key. I think that's the two most important things. Plus, I agree with Chris on machine learning.
I really appreciate your time, both of you, and Dan as well. Thank you so much for your insight. Thank you so much for your opinions. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the show, whether you're listening to it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, TuneIn, or watching on YouTube. If you are watching on YouTube, we'd love to hear from you. Comment below on what you think Geoff, Chris, and Dan, and myself, for that matter, have had to say. If you agree, if you disagree, all comments are welcome, and we will actually read out some of your comments. The ones that are acceptable to read. Lots of YouTube shows say, comment below, but then don't actually acknowledge or even like or read out your comments. No, we will. So do comment below. Thank you very much for watching and listening to this episode of the Final Furlong podcast. It was something a bit different. We're going to do some more of these as well in this style of show, so I hope you enjoyed it. Geoff, Chris, thank you so much for your insight. Really appreciate it. Please, God, we'll talk to you again very, very soon.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you.
And to Dan as well, by the way, for joining us. Thank you for watching. Look after yourself and each other. God bless.
The Final Furlong podcast is proudly brought to you by Geoff Banks Bet. Join the excitement and sign up to Geoff Banks online now to get 10% off any net losses returned as cash after your first month of betting up to £500 at geoffbanks.bet.